There we go. Welcome to our fall 2025 peer exchange. I'm Madeline Hiller, the planning practice and scenario planning program coordinator at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So the Lincoln Institute is a nonprofit think tank that seeks to improve quality of life through the effective use of land taxation and taxation, and stewardship of land. Within the Lincoln Institute, my team manages the Consortium for Scenario Planning. So the Consortium for Scenario Planning, if you're not already familiar, is a network of peers, practitioners, academics, and students who are all interested in scenario planning. We provide resources for scenario planning workshops, and hold annual RFP cycles. Additionally, we host peer exchanges like this one and do technical assistance programs with communities and planners. We also have a partnership with the American Planning Association. This is going on 5 years now, and with APA, we work with them to create the annual trend report for planners, where we describe different trends and driving forces that planners and the planning community should be looking out for in their work. Additionally, we host an annual conference. This year, our 9th annual conference will be in Salt Lake City, Utah from February 4th through 6th. This is a great opportunity to engage with the consortium. We'll have lots of great case studies and many different presentations on different tools and emerging methods in the scenario planning world. And today, during this peer exchange, we are very excited to welcome our colleagues from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC, Sarah Philbrick, the research manager, and Conor, a senior land use and transportation analyst. MAPC has been doing scenario planning for a very long time and has been involved in the consortium's network over many years. So we're very excited to have them here to discuss their summer 2025 project, conducting 4 land use scenarios using a travel demand model to understand the impact of different transit-oriented development strategies on greenhouse gas emissions in Greater Boston. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody to please mute yourself until the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And additionally, this event will be recorded in both English and Spanish, so you'll be able to access those after the event next week. Additionally, if any of you are interested in presenting at another peer exchange later in the year, please reach out to us using our collaboration request form. Now, without further ado, I welcome Conor and Sarah. They will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end.
Thank you, Madeline. Let me get my slideshow up here. Okay. That looks good. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to be talking, as Madeline was saying, about a project we worked on over summer of 2025, looking at a variety of scenarios around land use, transit-oriented development, and the impacts of that land use on travel behavior, transit ridership, vehicle miles traveled, and so on. This work comes kind of as a follow-on to some work we did earlier, sort of right after the pandemic. We were at that time interested in similar questions and exploring scenarios around different types of future land use throughout the MAPC region in eastern Massachusetts. In that particular study, we were also dialing down a little bit more further into some of the sort of pricing policies that would also be influential. So it was a combination of things like smarter growth scenarios, denser development in urban areas, and then things like VMT fees, changing the level of the gasoline tax and things like that, and trying to evaluate how those would combine to impact on vehicle miles traveled. We saw from that study roughly a 5% increase when we modeled out a sprawl scenario versus what we had termed a smart growth scenario. And then we saw large impacts from very high levels of either VMT fees or increases in the gas tax to generate VMT reductions. Um, Now, one of the drawbacks of our initial study was in how we did the land use and how we looked at generating different scenarios for future household growth, the spatial patterns of that household growth throughout our region. We were sort of working at a coarse municipal and sort of sub-regional geographic scale. So we called it Trends of the 2000s. That was kind of our business as usual, just carrying on from 2000 through 2010 and onwards, where we sort of see mixed growth in the suburbs, some in the core, some in the outer suburbs. We had a smart growth scenario that focused on having that household growth happen in sort of the Boston metro as well as around some of the gateway cities, and then a sprawl scenario that kind of pushed all of the future growth out into more outer suburbs. But this was the scale at which we were doing these scenarios, sort of collections of towns versus proper neighborhood level analysis. And so that's sort of what moved us forwards towards doing this more recent project. Um, we wanted specifically to explore land use scenarios that located future household growth in transit-oriented developments in neighborhoods around transit stations where accessibility to the transit and accessibility to employment and other amenities that transit provided would potentially show us, the impacts of those future scenarios on travel behavior, transit ridership, things like this. Um, Informed by the report that came out earlier this year from Boston Indicators and Transit Matters, looking at what are the levels of density. They call it transit supportive densities. So how many people do you kind of want or need to have living in the transit shed around a transit stop to support the level of service, the high frequency service of the light rail and the T. Um, Moderate frequency service, sort of what we've got with some of our commuter rail lines. So these were the kind of numbers we were looking at to design our scenarios at the densities of housing units per acre on that bottom line of sort of 6 for neighborhoods around the commuter rail, and for the neighborhoods closer into the core around bus stops and T stops, densities up around 16 housing units per acre. So that's kind of what drove us, as well as the MBTA Communities Act and the new zoning requirements for a lot of communities throughout our region to upzone around their transit stops, and make it possible to build this housing. So we had 3 scenarios really, that we settle on in the end, to explore kind of the range, that the edges cases, the widest range of sort of significant changes in our future land use across the region. Scenario 1 was basically a scenario where we took all the future household growth, which is MAPC, on a regular basis produces forecasts of population, household, and employment across the region out several decades, out to 2050 is our most recent time horizon for our projections of households. And so we had these numbers where we've already sort of forecasted a business as usual scenario as part of our usual process. And we wanted to say in scenario 1, what if all of that future household growth that we've predicted for all the towns in MAPC, instead of occurring sort of where business as usual would suggest it would occur, what if all of that household growth was occurring in the areas most suitable for transit-oriented development in every municipality? Scenario 2, we kind of took it a little further to the extreme, and we said, what if actually all of that household growth is going to occur entirely sort of within what we call the inner core communities, the 2021 towns sort of right around the city of Boston. And if all that growth were to occur, were to sort of not occur in the suburbs, but were to be located in those communities, and then also to be located in areas in those communities that were most suitable for transit-oriented development. And I'll talk about what most suitable means in the next couple of slides and how we determine that. And then scenario three, similar to what we had done in the previous study, we sort of reversed everything and said, what if actually everyone ends up moving out into the suburbs? We don't have growth in the core communities, and that the growth that does occur is occurring in basically the least suitable or non-transit oriented parts of these communities. So those are the three scenarios that we assembled. I'll show you now some of the tools we used to do so. So we leveraged an existing toolkit, which had been developed by our colleague Rachel Bowers here at MAPC. That was done as part of the lead up to the MBTA Communities Act and what we call three, also referred to it as 3A, as towns were preparing their zoning and trying to figure out how do we come up with a compliant, upzone for our MBTA Communities Act requirements. What are the parts of our town that we should include? What's sort of most suitable to consider upzoning to get more development in a way that will support, transit supportive densities in and around the transit stations. So this toolkit works at the level of individual parcels, so every parcel across the state, and it has a range of criteria that were used, to determine whether or not the parcel would be suitable for increased development. So not only, the obvious ones like how close is it to a commuter rail station or a bus stop or a T station, what are the jobs and other amenities that are accessible via transit from the options, around the parcel? Is there a good degree of walkability, accessibility to other, bikeability, walkability, and accessibility to the station and other amenities around it? What are the existing residential zoning capacities? How built up is it? How feasible is the development there? Are there open space restrictions, et cetera, things like this? And then, additional environmental factors, are there flood risks and things like that. So all of these different scores are put together in this tool and then synthesized and combined to kind of get a single score for each parcel. So this was basically already built out, and we could just leverage this to determine the suitability scores for, everywhere in our region, and then assign the development, the future household growth for each of our scenarios appropriately based on these scores. And so this is just a sort of coarse look. The colors just give you a sense of how, we generated, suitability at different scales. And this is where we sort of aggregate all the scores together. We work it up to the census block. All those red rings are half-mile buffers around transit stations. And we put all those indicators together. And what we did was we looked for each municipality, we ranked within the municipality what are the most suitable places. So it's not like what's the most suitable place throughout the entire region, but for any given town, if the town was going to think about where do we want to have the development occur, what would be the most suitable locations in that municipality. And so this is what it looks like when we generated the forecasted land use for our first scenario. And as I said before, this is our sort of regional transit-oriented development. The growth is all happening in each municipality pretty much the same as our business as usual scenario. But what's different is that instead of it growing kind of anywhere within those municipalities, the household growth is being assigned to those most suitable locations for transit-oriented development. So there's no change to the sort of same number of households in these towns in 2050 as we were predicting business as usual. We're just relocating them to the transit-oriented development locations within each of those towns. So that's kind of what it looks like for our first scenario, places where it's red or places where we've increased the number of households relative to our baseline, and blue are the places that have less households than in our baseline. The second scenario, as I mentioned, is again, we're putting households in places that have the highest suitability scores for transit-oriented development, but all of the growth post 2025 is occurring in these inner core communities, these municipalities right around Boston. As you see, that's where most of the red is showing up. That's where the shift in population and households is occurring relative to our baseline scenario in scenario 2. And again, in each of those 20 odd towns in the inner core, the highest suitable locations for transit-oriented development are where the households are assigned. And then this is what the sprawl scenario looks like. It's none of the growth in the inner core that we're forecasting ends up there. It ends up we shift it out into the suburbs, and then we basically take those suitability scores from our analytical toolkit. We put some negative signs in front of the criteria scores and basically came up with like an inverted suitability score for transit-oriented development. And that puts all of the growth kind of in the least suitable, least transit accessible locations of all of these towns. So this is the land use patterns that we put together. And these are the scenarios we wanted to test. And in order to test them, we worked with our colleagues at CTPS at the Boston MPO. The CTPS is the Central Transportation Planning Staff. They run what's referred to as the Regional Travel Demand Model. It's actually a statewide travel demand model. It's something that we work with them on a regular basis. We provide them land use data, population, employment, households as part of our forecasting process, and they implement this model, which then generates travel trips by different modes and purposes between zones all throughout the region and the state. Those trips are generated and then assigned to different networks, whether it's the road network or the transit network or the walking and biking network. And then the outputs from that model give us both information about the number of trips, the origins and the destinations, when and where those trips occurred, the purpose of those trips, whether it was a commuting to work trip or taking your kid to school trip or a trip you make after work on your way home, things like that, at different times of day for different purposes. And then it also gives us these trips by mode. So we know whether this was a vehicle trip, whether they took the commuter rail or the T, or whether they drove to the commuter rail and then took the commuter rail to the office, or whether they walked or biked. So this really gives us the ability to look in really great detail at the particular travel behaviors that result from changing the land use in our previous scenarios. And so I'll cut basically to some of the main takeaways. We ran these 3 scenarios. On the left-hand side there, just at the top left, that's our base year, but for the most part, I'm comparing everything for our 2050 forecast year. So the first column, LRTP 2019, that's our baseline level of daily auto vehicle miles traveled throughout the MAPC region, just a little shy of 67 million. Forecasted to increase to about 69.5 million in 2050 under our sort of baseline business as usual scenario. It's about 12 million auto trips a day and about 1 million transit trips a day. For our first scenario, scenario 1, it says we're calling it TOD regional here. That's basically a decline of about 300,000, not quite 300,000 vehicle miles traveled, decline in auto trips of about 100,000, slight increase in transit trips of about 10,000 on a daily basis. The second scenario, looking at the inner core communities, have all of the growth going forward, significantly more reduction in both auto trips and in VMT, and an increase in transit trips of almost 30,000 a day, which is doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to the average daily trips across the region, that's not an insignificant increase. And then in the sprawl scenario, as expected, everything gets worse. So we have significant increase in VMT on a daily basis. In the sprawl scenario, higher auto trips and a big drop off in transit trips and transit ridership, as most of those households are now living in non-transit accessible areas. So these are not incredibly large changes. I think we weren't really expecting to see significant double-digit percent changes here, even though some of these scenarios are pretty substantial in terms of the assumptions we've made about future household growth. It's unlikely everyone is just going to move into the inner core per se, and we'll have no growth in the suburbs. But that said, we did see relatively significant declines in vehicle miles traveled as we explored the increasing levels of transit-oriented development versus our baseline. Um, and when you think about it sort of at less than a regional scale, when we're talking about the number of auto trips being reduced here, 63,000 to 93,000 per day, yes, out of, millions. But that is essentially equivalent what we're seeing in scenario two to basically the entire inbound daily traffic volume on the Mass Pike as it comes into Boston every day. There's about 63,000 cars coming through, the Mass Pike at like the Alston tolls on any given weekday. So obviously these reductions would be seen across the region, not just on that road. But the impact of putting people in places where they have the option to mode shift into a transit trip versus a auto trip generates the output we expected when we were, implementing these scenarios in the model framework that we had available. Likewise, the sprawl scenario, increases the VMT almost by 2 million miles a day. That's, a 7% increase over the next 3 decades compared to our business as usual, which is very significant. And the transit trips, as I mentioned, 10,000 on the scenario one and then 30,000 on the scenario two is relatively significant at the level of what our transit system is currently carrying. This is just a map, and I'll go through these relatively quickly, just sort of showing what it looks like for the reductions in VMT at the municipal level in the different scenarios, because it's not homogeneous across the region. Obviously, different parts of our region have greater transit accessibility along the commuter rail lines in particular. And so in some cases, that's where you're seeing bigger reductions in vehicle miles traveled in these scenarios than in other places. So that's sort of how it shakes out for scenario one. Scenario two, again, we're seeing, lots of decreases in the VMT out in the suburbs, but that's because we've moved all of the people into the inner core. So we'll see slight increases of vehicle miles traveled in the inner core because that's where we've moved some of the households, but it's more than offset by the declines throughout the rest of the region, because not only are those places where there's less transit accessibility, but they're places where the average trip length tends to be longer because the distance from people's homes to the various destinations they need to uh, go to in a given day are longer. So not only are you more likely to make an auto trip, but that auto trip is more likely to be a longer auto trip than it would be if you lived in Boston or Cambridge or Brookline. And then in the sprawl scenario, it looks like a heart attack. So it just underscores the importance of the location of our future household growth with respect to the accessibility of transit, the locations where people have access to amenities, employment, and other destinations. And even though in this scenario we do see some small declines from the inner core households, it's more than exploded by the growth in the auto travel out in the far flung parts of the region. So overall, this was a very illustrative experience for us. I think we maybe had been hoping that we would have been seeing some larger changes. What we found were, I suppose, modest, not insignificant, not small per se, but I think not as large as maybe some of us would have hoped to have seen, considering what the literature tends to tell us about travel behavior for residential densities and transit accessible developments. But we did see everything kind of pointing in the directions we expected. So we saw gains in transit ridership, reductions in total vehicle travel in the region. But it did underscore that it's a complex series of decisions and behaviors that go into what kind of trips people make, where they make them, what mode they make them with. And it's a moderately inelastic travel behavior in general. It's sensitive to more than just your residential location. And there are a number of things that we weren't able to test in these scenarios that we'll be thinking about adding on in future. In particular, I think some of the big ones would have been looking at how vehicle ownership might change under scenarios of transit-oriented development. Do households have reduced vehicle ownership or availability in those locations versus others? We didn't make any of those changes in our scenarios. We kept vehicle ownership pretty much as is. Closely coupled to that would be parking requirements that would go along with potential transit-oriented development and future growth in those areas. The relationship between parking availability and vehicle ownership is also one that would be worth exploring to try to flesh out a more nuanced scenario of what transit-oriented development would really look like for future growth. And then notably, we didn't make any changes to the spatial patterns of employment throughout the region. So basically, employment was the same as it was in our business as usual scenarios. And this would be something that wouldn't necessarily be the case. Potential employment patterns can change as the spatial patterns of households can change. And so it would be interesting to explore the impacts of shifting employment centers into different areas in the region and how that might impact the amount of vehicle travel. And then that said, only a modest fraction of our overall travel and trips are for work commutes. And so there's a lot of other trips that happen that are influenced by your work commute. For example, any other trips you might make as part of your day after already going to work, trips you might make on your way home. Um, but there are a lot of trips that are not directly related to the location of your home and the location of your job. And so exploring some of the transit accessibility for those types of trips and where those destinations are relative to transit stations and to the development that might occur there would be interesting for us to continue to do further work in this space. So the single variable scenarios we started with were useful for establishing the sensitivity of our models and the way they address travel behavior, and keeping it clean enough and clear enough that we could say specifically, okay, we see this percentage of changes when we do this one thing that's a very specific thing, which is putting households in transit-oriented development in the future. But it does fail to capture some of these layered, multivariate, complex interactions that occur between the location of someone's home, their location of employment, the decisions they make about the trips they take to both their work and to other places. So a lot of the thinking we've now been doing after having established this sort of first round of scenarios at the neighborhood level is we now have this ability. We can do these very detailed block by block impacts, neighborhood level analysis of travel behavior for transit-oriented development. We are able to do this in a very sort of rapid, sustainable level of analysis where we can produce these scenarios, share them with our colleagues at CTPS, put it and have them run it through the travel demand model and look at some additional metrics as we basically give ourselves more questions with each answer that a round of scenario planning produces. So we're thinking about new things to add into our scenarios, additional variables, like I said, vehicle ownership, parking restrictions. Remote work is obviously a big thing that affects, the number of trips you take. It affects the types of trip you take. And it tends to generate more local trips for people who are working at home compared to the kinds of trips that household would make when the workers in the households were commuting to another location for the bulk of their day during the week. Looking at different scenarios for employment as well, as I mentioned, how might future changes and where the jobs and employment in the state and the region locates, how that would shift the relationship between people's homes and workplaces. And then looking again in some more detailed levels at corridor level, street and neighborhood level impacts of how these shifts in vehicle travel, transit ridership might have equity impacts, either positive or negative, for different parts of the region, and what parts of the region are well served and not well served by transit, and how increases to transit-oriented development and future growth in the regions that are well served might also have negative impacts on equitable metrics, excuse me. So we're looking to do some more additional scenarios going forward that combine a lot of these things together and start building a layer of a suite of different scenarios that allows us to talk intelligently and make policy recommendations about the types of transit supportive densities we want to see, where we want that development to be occurring, and what are the kinds of policies that could encourage that. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. I'm sure there are questions in the chat. I wasn't able to see the chat this whole time, but I'll stop sharing. I can obviously bring my PowerPoint back up and review any of the slides if people want to get into anything further.
Great. Thank you, Connor. We do have many questions coming in on the chat. I do invite everybody to turn on your video cameras if you do have questions. We'll start with some of these in the chat. So Ken Kruckemeyer asked, have you looked at the changes in household, municipal, and state budgets for each scenario? For example, will I save money or pay more as a result of the improved transit or expenditures on roads?
We did not look at the budget implications or any of the sort of price points for all of this. That's a fascinating line of inquiry to start looking at. I think some of the things we were starting to think about when we are trying to think about the next steps we might take with additional scenarios would be looking at the levels of transit service, what the pricing would be basically for a trip taken on a commuter rail line versus a vehicle trip, especially for some of the suburban transit-oriented development where you're really the only transit out there is going to be a commuter rail stop, and so it's providing you with potentially a commute to work, but maybe not transit access to a lot of other destinations you might need, and the commuter rail is not the most cheap of transit services provided throughout our region. So yeah, I think there's definitely space for analysis around the individual household level costs, and then the more town level or regional level costs of infrastructure and taxes and things like that, I think are probably a little further down the road for what we'd be able to model with this sort of framework we've come up with.
And then we have our next question was from Eugene Benson about when it comes to buses, what frequency and hours or days of operation would you expect is necessary for a bus system to have impact on TOD?
Well, I think generally speaking, we talk about high frequency, short headways. High frequency is being in the ballpark of sort of 15-minute headways on light rail. With buses, you like it to be a little faster, certainly at peak periods. I think maximum when you get something like a dedicated bus rapid transit with its own lane or whatever, you can push it up to maybe even 8 or 9 minutes between buses. Those levels are sort of the goals across the system. Obviously, different routes require, a lot more thinking than others. But those are the kinds of frequencies. And to be clear, in none of these scenarios were we actually changing the transit service levels for all of this. So that's something I think that would only improve quote unquote the metrics we're seeing for the reductions in VMT and the shifts to the transit mode. We basically left the existing service levels across the region, which are pretty good in some places and not so good in other places.
Yes, Heather, you have your hand raised.
Hi, thanks. Other people can raise their hands too if you want to speak and ask your questions. Thank you for your presentation. I was curious for scenario 3, where you're showing the sprawl and all of the housing going at the edges. Were there forces that your team discussed as what would cause that? Like what you're watching for to know that you might be headed that way, that sprawl is happening? Like you're showing an impact, but not a cause.
Yeah, no, I think that scenario is probably the least grounded in certainly observable trends or things that we think are going to happen. It was like in the previous study, we kind of just wanted a bracket out on the other end of the outcome space to give us a sense of how could it go completely wrong if it did go completely wrong like that. I think also when we talk about business as usual or the baseline scenario, our trends in this region and business as usual in this region is still relatively smart growthy. It's not perfect. It's not like we're getting only the growth in the most accessible, transit accessible, and dense places we want, but the overall trend in the region is not in the direction of like a runaway sprawl, that like is described in scenario 3. So it's more of a sort of cautionary scenario of if things really started to change away from our general trend, how bad could it be?
So our next question is, how do you envision using these results in policy development in the coming years? And are policymakers going to trust, rely on, or act on this information in any way?
Not sure I can answer that second question, the second part of the question, with any particular crystal ball I might have on my desk. We hope so. And these are sort of these scenarios. The way we're viewing them is that they've sort of laid the groundwork for us to start engaging along with policymakers along some of these questions. As the questions from this group here have already, highlighted, there are numerous levels of nuance and policy complexity that need to go into making decisions around the zoning and the infrastructure that goes around something like transit-oriented development, and how we can support that, and whether or not the data we're showing is producing, trends and impacts of the size or magnitude that might be expected. We feel that we've basically set up a nice baseline to then begin adding some of the nuance in and additional work and engaging with policymakers and our colleagues in the municipalities about what additional information they would want to see us look to include in some of this modeling to help them understand what are the best choices they can make for their communities in terms of balancing the competing needs of both, the benefits from this kind of development and the costs and work that would go into making it happen, making it
I think
sustainable.
I'll also add that I think the research really highlights that lots of things need to happen on top of each other if the goal is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So like Conor said, we didn't look at increased transit service. We didn't look at car ownership. And I think what this shows is that if you only change land use without those things or without parking strategies or whatever, the impacts you get are much lower than if you were able to layer those things on. And that's a bit of a tricky political conversation because you don't want these types of results to show like you can do all this work in land use and it doesn't make that big of a difference, because that's not totally true, but that's what some people might take away from this. I think what we're trying to have folks take away from this is you need to do the land use, but you need to do these other things to make land use more effective. And that's the kind of conversation we're trying to have with folks on the land use side, on the environmental side, and on the transportation side, so we can all sort of move towards shared goals.
And that was Sarah, everybody. She did this work with Conor at MAPC.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet has been going in and out of my house, so I am on my cell phone.
So next we have a question from Nahuel in Argentina. And they're wondering how the COVID-19 pandemic changed public transport trips here. Because in Buenos Aires, they are 40% less with passengers in the subway compared to pre-pandemic.
I don't know the exact levels. I believe we have returned to nearly to pre-pandemic levels in some of our transit service. Certainly not in the commuter rail. I think that's the place where I think we might be back to 60% or something like that. I'd have to look at that. The MBTA does publish all this data in their performance metrics. And I think that is, that's part of that is sustained levels of telecommuting vis-a-vis all of us on a screen right now instead of in a room somewhere. And the commuter rail has kind of suffered the most from that. There's definitely been changes to the transit service as well. So it's not just on the demand side. There have been responses on the supply side from the MBTA. But I think we're slowly crawling our way back, at least in some of the core metro areas, towards a pre-pandemic level, but we're not there yet.
And
Our
before,
vehicle miles traveled, on the other hand, have returned quite quickly back to the levels of pre-pandemic, so that didn't last very long.
Before this next question, I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question that you'd like to ask aloud, feel free to raise your virtual hand, or if you'd like to add to any responses or join in on the discussion, you're welcome to do so. So our next question is from Deborah Butler, and she asks, what does most suitable mean? Does this mean it's profit driven or most beneficial in the criteria?
So the suitability criteria, we didn't do an analysis of like, would this be an economically feasible location for a developer, from a developer's perspective, to build housing here per se. We were mostly interested in, is the location suitable for transit-oriented development in the sense that it's near transit, that transit provides access to jobs in other destinations. Can you build there at all? Is it already fully built out, or is there capacity there to build? It can't be a wetland or a conservation area, things like that. So it was more about kind of feasibility at like a minimum threshold of like, can you build here? And then does it meet the needs of how we're sort of thinking of the types of development we'd want to see around transit?
And then our next question is from John Hersey. Did you study the potential impact that investments in polycentric commercial centers and smaller transit services like Lawrence and Merrimack Valley Transit would have in reducing VMT and or enhancing the state's TOD push?
Oh, we did not specifically. I think that's something I'm really rather keen on looking into going forward, is that, as I mentioned in one of those slides, the majority of our trips are not the classic commute from home to work. There's all these other destinations we travel to, and it's not just about bringing our homes closer to those destinations. It's about bringing those amenities and destinations closer to where people live and making them accessible, via transit services, regional transit authorities as well. All of the regional transit services from like the non-MBTA transit authority are all in the model, so they're all accounted for. They're obviously smaller. than the breadth of the MBTA, but those are all in there. So we also were considering when we're talking about a transit-oriented development location in Lawrence or wherever, or in some of these towns further out that don't really have MBTA or commuter rail access. We were locating them, as close as possible to whatever existing transit services they might have. So I think expanding the scenarios and looking more at like what are the kinds of destinations and I think somewhere else in the chat someone mentioned this, what are the other amenities that can come along with transit-oriented development in mixed-use scenarios that provide destinations and reduce the need to therefore travel to some other town or some other location, regardless of mode.
Ann Carroll from the DCR Office of Water Resources asked, is the suitability tool that you showed publicly available, and are the scoring criteria transparent?
Yes, and yes, I will find the link and drop it in the chat before the webinar is over.
And then Eugene is back again asking, is there a method to get from vehicle miles traveled to average daily trips? He uses it in MEPA.
So the travel demand model produces both separately. It produces both estimates of trips for, I think, 4 time periods. So there's daily trips, but it also breaks it out by morning, midday, evening peak, and overnight. And so yeah, and if you want to reach out directly, we're happy to connect you with the folks at CTPS, and as well as the data we already have, if you're interested in directly getting data on the trips.
And I seem to have missed one question in the chat from Ernan Yulsha. Have you looked at household income when doing these scenarios?
So we did not make changes to the forecasted household incomes. Household income is tied very strongly to vehicle ownership or vehicle availability, number of vehicles available. So it does, among plenty of other pathways, influence the way people make travel decisions. But no, we did not look at that. That's, again, there are many things on the future wish list that we'd like to add.
That brings me to a question. So if you were to do this again, what limitations would you try to improve? It's kind of a two-parter. And then what other scenarios would you want to explore more?
Yeah, I think, as I said, there have been a number of things that we knew we weren't including when we started, and we knew we couldn't include and weren't going to be able to, but that we definitely wanted to do in the future. I think really when it comes to things that are directly influential on the metrics and the indicators we were interested in, namely vehicle miles traveled, transit ridership, associated greenhouse gases from the vehicle miles traveled. I think vehicle ownership is a big one, and parking and vehicle ownership in particular, in terms of things that we will have the ability to influence when you are generating transit-oriented developments, when you're permitting them, when you're doing your rezoning under 3A, required parking minimums, things like that. It would really be interesting to test specifically, a range of levels of changes that might actually be implementable as policies, by towns or by local governments, that might have a bigger impact beyond just, the number of units you might have around your transit station. So that would be a big one. And then I think there's a lot of questions around employment location and the other types of trips that people make that would sort of be high on the list for what we'd want to explore, in these sort of layered, combined scenarios that Sarah referred to, that really are what's going to be what the future looks like in whatever form, it takes, it's going to be multiple efforts along multiple different axes of policymakers that have to kind of get on the same page with doing a little bit in all of these buckets to get, a greater than the sum of the parts response from the development process.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask? Feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. We have a few more minutes. So Pedro Sierra asks how consistent are the access measures used to define scenarios and those resulting from these transportation simulations?
Yeah, so all across the whole region, everything is scored with the same suitability toolkit, the same scoring. And so the transit accessibility scores are, kind of uniformly done across the region. So it sort of treats, we obviously know the level of service of transit for different places. And so it's not just, oh, is there a bus stop there or is there a T station there? Does it have high service and where does it take you? So while everything's sort of done by the same metric, transit services that give you greater access to jobs and other destinations score higher, for a location you'd want to develop than, a commuter rail that comes once an hour or 5 times a day.
And we have a question from Ken.
First, I'd like to say thanks for the presentation. The thing that I found important was that you weren't reading for the slides. The slides were additional information. If we were listening to you and not looking at the slides, we wouldn't have learned nearly as much. If we were just looking at the slides, we wouldn't have learned nearly as much. So I think your presentation was an important way of communicating the work that you've done. I would say, though, that I think that to get people to listen up rather than just planners, knowing more about the cost impacts. Is this going to cost me more money? Is my town going to save money because what's going to happen to the MBTA because there will be more riders? Those kinds of things that would bring it home to the average person who you would like to also have understand this good work that you've done, I think would help in communication and broadening the audience and ultimately making your work more effective.
Thank you. Totally agree.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that feedback. And I think that's something we're definitely interested in doing. I think we're a lot of the way there in terms of a lot of the pieces and the data are there. We just need to sort of pick them up, put them together, and figure out what the narrative really is around this, and where do the savings lie, if they may be, and where are the potential costs that are real and will need to be figured out for the various stakeholders involved. It's great comment.
Thank you, Ken. And then we have our final 2 questions from the chat. So Samantha Carr asks if you could share the technical process of how the estimated population/household growth was dispersed in each scenario, what tools were used, or was a custom workflow created?
Yeah, so the forecasts of households and population are done with this sort of larger collaborative process. And we used a piece of software called UrbanSim, which allocates our forecasted regional households down to census blocks. That's our sort of business as usual scenario, and how we go about doing our projections to the future every few years. So that gave us the baseline, but that wasn't how we actually then simulated the other scenarios. It was basically a workflow in R and in ArcGIS, where we identified the blocks that had the highest suitability scores. We came up with the number of households we wanted to move around for the given scenario. And then it was essentially, we were randomly sampling from our baseline saying, okay, in this town, there's 5,000 people and they live where they live. but we're going to move 500 of them into the transit-oriented development blocks. And we just picked 500 random households from that town, from other parts of the town, and then put them into our transit-oriented development. For the sprawl scenario, it basically worked backwards in that same process. And then from the scenario 2, where we moved all the growth into the core, the same general idea. We took the households, what we were projecting to be the growth from now to 2050, and said, those are all going to go into these towns now. And again, randomly taken from the other, from all the outer suburbs, sort of proportionally, and put into the towns in the core.
Great. And then finally, and this is a great segue into our wrap up, Amy Cotter asks, it sounds like the Met Council is also doing similar analyses. And do you know of any other MPOs or planning groups that are doing similar TOD analyses? And have you been able to collaborate and compare findings?
I don't think we have yet collaborated and compared findings. I can post my email contact also. Sarah, do you want to chime in on this at all? Have you?
We haven't talked to them recently about this, but thanks for flagging that. And we've been talking to other folks about the more technical side of modeling with urban sim and things like that, but we haven't talked about TOD related scenarios with anyone.
I'm going to swipe 30 seconds here and just say I'm from the council. And what I've noticed is there's a collegiality and familiarity amongst modelers that they will call each other at the drop of a hat. I don't know why, but the rest of us need a kind of prompting to really get together and do this. I think the consortium is a great potential convener for that discussion, and maybe we should talk about that more. We all have a slightly different organizational construction, but everything that Conor's talking about, modeling and positioning, it's very familiar to what we do. And yeah, I'll stop there. I'm complete. Thanks for doing this too, by the way. This is fantastic.
Yeah, and thank you for doing great work like MAPC is. So to wrap up, and I'll segue into plugging our conference, we have at the 2026 conference, which I mentioned at the beginning, we have a lot of great scenario planning practitioners who will be coming and sharing their cases similar to what Conor did today. So if you're interested, there's the link with more information. We'll have the agenda coming out in about a month or so. And then other opportunities are joining peer exchange webinars like this one. You can also, there's a link in the very beginning of the chat to our collaboration request form. So if you're practicing scenario planning and want to share about your process and your findings, please fill that out and we can collaborate on something similar. I believe Conor put his email in the chat for those who are interested, as well as those links to the resources that they used. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you continue to engage with the consortium moving forward. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.